The beauty of patchwork today is that we get to cut with the rotary cutter, which means that we cut multiple layers very quickly and very accurately. And that means too that we can get onto the fun bit, which is the sewing. However, fabric and the sewing machine aren't a natural companion because the fabric has a way of fighting back against the sewing machine mechanism. What happens is the sewing machine foot will drive the top fabric towards you and the feed dogs underneath pull the bottom fabric away from you. So by definition, there's this kind of action going, one fabric against the other. And I'm sure you've realized that without understanding quite how it happens. So on a long piece of fabric, that actually becomes quite important. But it is equally important on a small piece of fabric, like a 3-inch square, because we've cut them so they are absolutely perfect. When we've sewn them, we want them to stay that way. So here are a couple of tips that I hope will help you manage the fabric. I don't think it makes a huge amount of difference whether you've washed the fabric or not. I do make too many quilts to pre-wash my fabric. I do sometimes colour test it, but that's a whole other argument, and you can check out kind of the answers on the blog. But if you're buying a pre-cut, there's no way you're going to pre-wash that. So a lot of quilts in today, quilt making is done with fabric that has not been pre-washed, which means it's kind of got a bit of stability to it. It feels kind of different to a washed fabric. If you have washed your fabric and you wanted it to get that feel back again, you could use spray starch. You can use a product called Best Press, which is a kind of starch, but doesn't leave any kind of dandruff behind when you iron it. It is a great product, I have to say. But you can just use the fabrics as they are. Whether you have pre-washed them or not really doesn't make any difference to your accuracy. So what I do is I tend with plain squares, I tend not to use pins. I will make sure that my fabrics live absolutely above each other at the beginning. I will put them into my sewing machine, as it were. I've got my foot all caught here. And I sew off my thread saver. And I can then just feed the fabric in, you can see. And then I've got my needle into the fabric. Some of you will have very sophisticated machines where that will happen the minute you touch the foot. Those of us with slightly older generation machines, I try to stop with the needle down all the time. Then I will come to the bottom of my square and I will hold on to it with my fingers and make sure they live absolutely above each other. If you want to put a pin in, that's fine, but we will have to get rid of the pin when we get to it. So we're going to sew all the way down to the end. And I'm going to chain piece. So I'm going to hold this fabric until my needle comes off the bottom of the fabric. Don't think, oh, I'm nearly there, and abandon the fabric. You must sew in a straight line right to the end of the fabric. And if you get into the habit, even if it's a single piece, of using a thread saver, that encourages you to sew right to the end. So I'm going to put the next piece in so that I'm kind of making a full patch. So I've sewn I kind of do it automatically. I've sewn a couple of stitches, I hold on to the bottom, and I will hold on with this hand all the way to the bottom, making sure that I sew straight to the bottom. Then I can relax a little bit and use my thread saver. I need my things, and sew down. If you're using, I just use this as a scrap. If you're thinking of doing those leaders and enders, then obviously again you have to sew all the way down to the end very neatly. Now what I'm going to also show you is how I then turn this into a full patch and be accurate. Those fabrics are absolutely level with each other. If when you sew, the machine has a tendency to misalign those, it means that you have got an amount of drag. As I said at the beginning, the foot is pushing the top fabric and the feed dogs are pulling the bottom. So they're kind of working one towards you, one away from you. And I'm going to use that mechanism to work in my favor on the next stage of this full patch. So let me just turn those around because I've done them in the same order. So on my full patch, I want to make it like this. So finger press the seams to the darker of the fabric, in this case to the purple, and I'm going to notch them together. Now, there is, again, this discussion, open seams, closed seams. For me, at this stage and for this piece of patchwork, I leave my seams closed. As I say, push them to the darker fabric. That top fabric that I'm going to sew here is going to be facing away from me. The bottom fabrics are coming towards me. So what will happen with the machine mechanism, it will push them just that smidgen together rather than pulling them just that smidgen apart. So when I've got the opportunity, I make the machine work with me. I put a pin in horizontally right on that sewing. Those of you with the Janome foot that's got the metal right hand stop on their 1/4 inch foot, you will know that you can't put the pin beyond that. Those of us who have got an open foot, I can, but it's not a good habit to get into. Again, I'm going to start my fabrics together here. So I'm just going to sew onto my fabric, 2 or 3 steps. I'm going to hold on to this where I've got my pin and just ease them together. And I'm going to sew right up to the pin. Take the pin out. That's particularly important with pins like this or even thicker. With these tiny, tiny pins, not quite so important, but nevertheless a good habit. So now that's held and I'm right up on the seam. I will hold these 2 together. I will make them fit because I haven't pressed all of this. The fabrics are fighting me, and I will machine sew all the way down to the bottom, holding on to them so my fabrics stay absolutely together onto my thread saver. So that encourages me to keep sewing. The machine will continue to sew, and we've got a perfect center, and all the outside edges are also perfect. If they've got misaligned, if that's an issue that you have, then I seriously ask you to consider maybe what I'm doing would help you. The next thing I wanted to show you was what happens when we have a triangle on a square. What happens is that you end up having to, this is a half square triangle unit, so this is my straight grain and this is my straight grain. So we're going to match this up here. And when I flip it over, you can see that the part nearest you has an ear. That's the way it should be. It should have an ear. And the distance between here, which is where I'm going to sew, and here will be the 1/4 inch. So again, if I put this in here just to hold it for the minute, I will align the bottom edge. Now, some of the machines are happier with you feeding, as it were, a flat bottom into the machine. So if you find with your machine that's the case, then just accept that that's the way your machine likes to be. Mine doesn't matter so much, but because this is, I need that, I think, to be more accurate, I would start with that so that if there's any drag, it pushes it to the far end. So let's sew this way up, all the way down to the bottom. Make sure that that is held in place. I'll hold it with my pin so that I can take my finger out of the way. I'm going to again sew all the way down to the bottom. And then I can just pop this in. Be a bit cavalier now. Whiz away, as they say. So we're going to open this so that that lives like that. If this one was going on, if I wanted this to be here, then I would match this seam here and again sew this way so that it will create the 1/4 inch for me. It doesn't really matter which way that one underneath is. But now I can feed, again, this flat bottom, feed that in first. Do a couple of stitches, hold this. You'll notice that I haven't pressed anything other than with my fingers. If you're using patchwork fabrics, they really are very happy to be finger pressed. The only bit of fabric you're worried about is where you're sewing. So if I open this up, we've now got, again, a nice flat bottom. We can trim that ear off and we've got a perfect, at least I hope it is, perfect 1/4 inch. We've certainly got a decent seam allowance between here and the end, so that when I come to sew this onto maybe a large half square triangle, I know where I'm heading. And I would turn that over if I was going to when I sew this on, so that I can see where I'm aiming for. You want to be aiming for this point here, just this side of it when we sew the 1/4 inch. As I say, I would neaten that off. And finally, we've got what are called quarter square triangles. These are used a lot in square in a square motifs. That means the big difference is not just about the size, it's about where the grain is. The grain on this is here, this is the bias edge, and this is this is the straight edge, and these are the bias edges. So when you've got that on here, they will have ears, top and bottom. I would find out where the middle is, and I'd put the pin in there. I'm just going to eyeball it for the minute, because again, we need to end up with a seam allowance. Now, again, if you find your machine pushes, you may find that it's better to sew from this side, because that has the bias seam captured underneath, rather than this side. You will know with your machine. All machines are slightly different, but you have no flat bottom to feed through. You have to feed that that pointy bit through. Again, if you find that your machine isn't happy with this, you could trim this off so that it becomes a flat bottom, because that's superfluous fabric. You really don't need it. And you're going to finger press that, and when this one goes on here, it will create that same 1/4 inch that we've got here. So I hope you found that helpful to do a little bit more precise quilting, patchwork, particularly after you've done such lovely precise cutting.